And welcome back to Spiritual Strength. And we're back again with a repeat guest, John Salza. John, thank you for joining us.
Hey, Gene, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So, everyone talks about the crisis in the church. All right. We all know this is a result of people not living the Fatima message. And once Fatima is fulfilled, we have the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary. Then this all goes away. So more people need to live the Fatima message. But no one really talks exactly how we should be speaking about the crisis in the church. We want to be loyal sons of the church under the Holy Father, obedient, innocent as doves, yet also wise as serpents. And there are real problems in the church. And it seems like everyone's talking and no one's listening. So it'd be great to do a show on how we speak about the crisis in the church. So just any initial thoughts you might have with that.
Well, again, I don't have real prepared comments, so it's kind of a free flowing discussion. First of all, we have to acknowledge that there is a crisis in the church. And what do we mean by that? Well, we mean a lot of Catholics just don't know their faith. They've been led astray. But the crisis, as I've come to conclude, is not just concerning the liberal errors on the left. Okay, they also concern, Gene, the overreaction, which has resulted in liberal errors on the right, on the extreme right. This is very important to understand. There has been a reaction and then a consequent overreaction, and I think we need to strike a balance. I mean, of course, we can all acknowledge there's been a decline in vocations and belief in the real presence, and this has been attributed to the banality of the Novus Ordo liturgy and the fact that the Council Fathers didn't really want that. I mean, they all wanted Gregorian chant in Latin and ad orientem, okay, and then you have that compared to what these various bishops' conferences did. Okay, so we can recognize that, yeah, to the extent that elements have been introduced into the Catholic liturgies that have watered down the faith, that is bad. But our reaction can't be so excessive as to say the Novus Ordo rite itself is bad or itself is evil. You see, this is just one example. There's a distinction between how the rite is celebrated and the rite itself, right? Just as there is a distinction between what a Vatican II document says literally and how it might be interpreted. It might be interpreted either orthodox or heterodox. So there has to really be a balance, I think, as we navigate through this crisis. And what helps us with that balance is to truly understand the Catholic faith and the hierarchy of truths and what we are as Catholics obliged to believe and what we're not obliged to believe. So I think that would start there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I look at Donum Veritatis, and it talks about the three different levels of teaching, if I have that correct. But the third level in particular about the ordinary magisterium, when the Pope or bishops put forth something in their ordinary teaching authority, we're required submission of intellect and will. Maybe speak more about that and what that means for us.
Yeah, you would be referring to what we would really call the authentic magisterium. And the authentic magisterium teaches in an ordinary way, right? It can teach by virtue of encyclicals or various types of letters or even speeches that the Pope may make. But maybe we should step back, Gene, and look at the hierarchy of truths that the Church gives us for belief. That the first is those truths which the Church proposes to us as divinely revealed. They're in divine revelation, and the Church teaches them as divinely revealed. Those are truths which we must assent to with divine and Catholic faith, supernatural faith. They're infallible. The second category would be truths that we must definitively hold. Again, with the assent of faith, they're also infallible. They're not being proposed as divinely revealed, but they're so connected to revelation as having to be true with the absolute infallible certitude that they're true. For example, the universal and peaceful acceptance of a pope, or this was a valid ecumenical council. Dogmatic facts would be the such truths that are connected to revelation, so that to believe in the revelation that there is a primacy of Peter, we have to believe that the current reigning pope, who everyone accepts as the pope, is the successor of Peter. That would be a dogmatic fact related to the revealed truth. And then that third category, Gene, that you mentioned would be the authentic magisterium, where the Church is not proposing a truth that we must believe with faith, with supernatural faith, but still, because it comes from her authentic teaching office, we're supposed to be given what the church calls a religious submission of intellect and will. So that's not Catholic faith. That's a submission of obeisance, of religious deference. There's a presumption that it's true, but all the theologians, even before Vatican II, taught to the extent that there is something in an authentic but non-binding, non-infallible teaching, okay, that cannot be reconciled with what is revealed, either in the first category to be held definitively, in the second category, then we can suspend judgment. Now, what we should do there, Gene, to answer your question, is we should always interpret authentic teachings in light of tradition and immediately reject the erroneous or heretical interpretation. Our sedevacantist friends do the opposite. They will immediately say that this teaching is heretical. It can't be interpreted in light of tradition. That's not the Catholic approach. I mean, the popes have taught this. Auctorem Fidei comes to mind. We're supposed to reject or denounce the perverse interpretation. And then to the extent that we can reconcile it, we can. If we can't, if we're learned enough, well, we reserve judgment. We can suspend judgment because the assent of intellect and will is a conditional assent. Unlike faith, which is unconditional, there is a conditional to it. We presume it's true, but if we can't, we can suspend judgment. But really, the church doesn't allow us to publicly dissent and accuse the magisterium of teaching a heresy or even error. That would be problematic.
Right, and we hear a lot of things like that, especially pertaining either to the council, the Novus Ordo, or even post-conciliar magisterium. We hear words like heresy and evil, thrown intrinsically evil, just thrown around loosey goosey. Talk about how that we can't do that. There has to be a better way. And how should we be speaking about these? What would be a better way to, maybe it's not speaking directly about it, but more asking questions?
Well, to many of my trad friends, frankly, a lot of these people are really clueless about traditional Catholic theology. Okay, so here they are pontificating about what's heresy in conciliar documents, and yet they don't know basic theology on the marks of the church, the attributes, jurisdiction, sacramental intention, on and on and on and on. I mean, so it's an overreaction. Now, having said that, we can say, and again, if you study history, we can point out circumstances where popes have erred and, in fact, have committed grievous errors in their non-binding, non-fallible, authentic magisterium. So I'm not here promoting the idea that everything that comes from the magisterium is infallibly safe. That is not what the church has said, although some people, especially the sedevacantists, promote that idea. That is really not, in my view, a Catholic doctrine, because popes have erred. I can give a number of examples. Pope Nicholas erred in giving a heretical baptismal formula. You can look this up when he was addressing a dubia in a specific region, and he said you can either baptize in the name of Trinity or the name of Christ. And that's just one example. Another one is Pope Celestine III's error on the indissolubility of marriage, where he erred on his interpretation of the Pauline privilege, which would allow a separation of non-sacramental of a non-sacramental union where both spouses were not baptized in certain cases. Pope Celestine actually allowed a woman to remain in her adulterous relationship after her husband apostatized and left the marriage, and then she entered into a marriage with another man and had children with him. The Pope actually said she was allowed to do that. He was totally in error, and the subsequent Pope actually condemned the error. Pope Gregory did a similar thing where one of the spouses was incontinent and he allowed another spouse to exit an indissoluble sacramental marriage. I mean, these are just a number of examples. There are more, but the bottom line is popes can err. If a pope is not teaching as Peter, and what I mean by that, he's not binding or loosing, he's not exercising the keys of Peter to bind the church to doctrine, there is no assurance of infallibility there, or even a charism of safety. One might think that the Holy Ghost assists, but there is fallible assistance, not just infallible assistance. And so we know historically that popes can err, but again, if Catholics will understand the hierarchy of truths, then it's not that big of a deal. Okay, fine, the popes can err And what we say there, Gene, is to the extent a pope would err in the authentic magisterium, he's not teaching as Peter, as pope, he's teaching as a private doctor. So even though he's using his teaching office to teach, if he's not defining doctrine, he can err. And unfortunately, we see this case throughout history, and with the conciliar popes. I mean, there's no exception. We can certainly maintain that we at least perceive there to be inconsistencies or incompatibilities or potential errors in some of these things. But I really have yet to find a statement, that is directly contrary to a dogma of the faith. And I'm open to confronting whatever those are, because you have to make distinctions when you look at these things. But if we understand the hierarchy of truths and we understand that popes can err, if we do perceive an error, that doesn't like jolt us, right? It doesn't like shake our faith. It shouldn't have anything to do with how we perceive the church as really the true church and bride of Christ.
Is it licit for lay people to be basically giving labels that are theological censures to the Pope and to the magisterium? Because we hear that all the time, not just heresy, but oh, this Pope is being or the bishop is saying this or that. Is that even licit for a lay Catholic to do?
Well, under canon law, 212 gives us the right and even the duty, according to our competence, to make our concerns known to the pastors of the church, which includes our bishops and the Holy Father. But as I did with my concerns about the Society of St. Pius X, I submitted a dubia. I didn't come out and condemn the society. I went to my bishop and submitted my questions to him and received a judgment. And that's how you're supposed to handle these things. If it can be handled at the parish level, go to your parish priest. If it's a diocesan issue, go to your bishop. If it concerns the universal church, go to the Holy See. I mean, that's what we should be doing. But I think we need to be careful in going too far, because what I've seen is when you go too far, a lot of these people end up actually leaving the church. They actually exit the bark of Peter and now turn themselves against the church. And all of a sudden, everybody in proper authority becomes their enemy. And that's the danger.
Right. Now I remember reading about a legal axiom, contra proferendum. I might have got that wrong, but dubious words are to be interpreted against the drafter of the document, basically. So I see a lot of people applying this to the church. Like, well, there's an ambiguous statement here, so it's against. So basically, the burden of proof is on the church. Wouldn't the burden of proof be on the layperson? Maybe we don't understand. We're not theologians.
Of course, Auctorum Fide, which I believe was issued in 1791, I think it was Pius, I'm trying to remember the Pope, said just the opposite. They said, to the extent there's a magisterial pronouncement, we are, to the extent there's a concern, we are to denounce the perverse interpretation of it. I mean, the benefit of the doubt has to go to the one in authority, the one in charge, beginning with the Holy Father himself. So, the conflict is, as Catholics, we have a right to true doctrine and we have a right to clarity. That's true. And to the extent we're not being fed, what we should be fed, it can be frustrating. Okay. But the overreaction is to say, they don't have any authority, or I can reject whatever they say. No, that's not true. First, try to interpret in light of tradition. And if you can't, suspend your judgment. And of course, as I've always advocated, the recognize and resist position, we recognize the duly and lawful authority of the church. And to the extent my priest or my bishop or even the Pope himself would command me to do something evil, I'm not going to do it. That doesn't mean I depose them and say they don't have any authority. But if someone in authority, commands us to do something outside the scope of their authority or to sin, of course, we recognize and resist. But there's the balance, right? We don't say, yeah, because it comes from authority, it must be true. Well, we presume it is, but if we can't reconcile it, then we don't. But we don't go on the opposite extreme and say, I reject the authority in itself. That's a problem.
Right, and I've made all of these mistakes. So we're not talking down on anyone who's currently in this place before. But I remember several times saying, well, just read everything before 1960, so you don't get confused. But that's just not how the church works, and it's not like everything was perfect then either.
Right. I think we mature, and maybe you've matured more quickly than I have, Gene. But I've been in my early 30s. I was a little more skeptical of things, and I think as I've read the documents of Vatican II over the years, and I've studied them for over 25 years, all different translations, even looking at the Latin and so forth. Personally, I've come to the conclusion that Vatican II was a test from God, a test of faith, where God permitted the Council Fathers to formulate statements in such a way that some may interpret them as contrary to tradition. And the test was, whether we would say, no, we're going to interpret these in light of tradition. That was really a test of faith. I mean, this latest document that's come out on Fiducia Supplicans, which is, in my view, very scandalous, shows how far Christ will go in terms of permitting things to come out of the official authentic magisterium that can divide and even cause scandal. But again, we're not dealing with a truth that the church is proposing for our belief. We're dealing with a discipline, which again I think is scandalous and problematic. But if you know those hierarchy of truths, you're not going to have the tendency to overreact. You're going to call it what it is, but you're not going to overreact to it.
Right. And even as I hear you speak about this, you being careful with your words as a lawyer, myself as a school psychologist, we know the importance of words and how we have to be careful with it. Just even this saying several times, my opinion, is that the way we should be speaking more, like letting it be known that it's our opinion and not making a declarative statement, especially for those of us that have social media pages and channels with a lot of followers. People are looking to us thinking that we have the answer, and we're not the magisterium, far from it.
Yeah, it depends, Gene, on what you're talking about. I mean, when I'm presenting church teaching, it's not my opinion, it's what the church teaches. Okay. So to the extent that there's something that's come out of Rome that I perceive as incompatible with that, well, that would be my opinion. If I felt strongly about it, that I've done my diligence, I would present the reasons why I concluded that way. But again, it's fact specific. In this latest document, right, Fiducia Supplicans, and I've read this over and over again. I mean, the document affirms the traditional teaching of marriage. So there's a doctrinal judgment in that document, which is 100% true. Okay. Now, the problem is there appears then to be a discipline that permits a blessing that contradicts the doctrine. Now, it appears that the Pope is asking us to make a distinction between the individuals that constitute the couple and the homosexual union itself. I would tell the Holy Father, fine, please tell me how to do that. Here's an example, Gene, where I still don't know how that's possible, but I'm open to the magisterium clarifying it. I'm not sure it'll be able to, because from my perspective and, trying to be a faithful Catholic, I don't understand how you can bless a sodomite couple without blessing the union, because they are a couple by virtue of their sodomite union. Okay. Now, if that document would show me from scripture, from tradition, from the patristics, from magisterial pronouncements, that this is how you divide the sodomitic union from the couple, okay, then I fine. But I have suspended judgment on this internally without publicly dissenting, but I've suspended judgment because I don't know how that's possible. I do believe that you can bless the individuals within the sodomite union if you're blessing them as individuals, but as a couple, and because the document refers to couple, not individuals. I've been unable to. I've talked to canon lawyers about this. They've been unable to reconcile it. So the doctrinal judgment is correct, but the discipline which permits a practice that could contradict it, again, that's not evil on its face, but we have a right to clarity. And let's face it, this is causing scandal. Okay. And scandal is a big problem because it harms weak souls and it undermines the moral authority of the church, all while preserving the church's infallibility, because this discipline, number one, it's not a doctrine, it's a discipline, and it doesn't fall within those two categories. You see how you can reconcile this? It's not binding. It's not binding. And a priest doesn't have to do it, but it's the scandal. So, I'm going on and on about it, but I'm just thinking through your question in terms of my own personal issue with this latest thing that came out of the Vatican, and it's problematic. But I've struck a balance because I know when the church is teaching something for me that I must assent to, and when there's room not to. And this is such a case.
Right. And unfortunately, what we see is the overreaction, where because we've seen a lot of ambiguous statements, I guess even it didn't begin at the Second Vatican Council, but maybe that's where it started to get more common or
Yeah.
something. And so what happened is people now have a categorical rejection and just an overall suspicion of anything that comes from the magisterium, Vatican II or after that.
Yeah.
And we can't, and that's just not fair. We can't do that as Catholics, to just categorically reject it, and then even some people taking it a step further. And I was regrettably in these lines where you're
Hmm.
trying to enlist other allies, friends and family against open
Yeah.
against bishops. Right?
I know. I know. I always want to get into specifics. If I am either, conversing with a Protestant or even a Catholic, we can speak in general terms, but you have to drill down. So if you have a problem with Vatican II, let's go to the text and read the statement, and let's contextualize it and understand what it's saying. I've invariably been able to work through those, not only on my own, but with other people, and say, wait a minute, I can see that. You're right about that. Subsisted is one of them. There's this whole thing about the Church of Christ subsists in the Catholic Church, and that's heretical. That's nonsense. If you look at subsisted and Trump and the whole evolution of that word, and even Cardinal Ratzinger, the word subsisted, again, this is just another example that came into my mind. It's actually stronger than the word is. The Church of Christ is the Catholic Church. Subsisted means was, is, and ever shall be. It perdures to the end. That's what subsisted means. And unfortunately, the Sedevacantist and the Society of St. Pius X and others continue to promote this false narrative about subsisted, even though the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, and I think it was 2007, came out and rejected that interpretation. And now this has been out here for 17 years, and they still promote this false narrative. So, Gene, there's another example, where Catholics, glom on to something that the rad trads have said for years, and they really don't know, the background of the word, who came up with it, what the Council Fathers debated, why it was chosen, and the fact that the CDF then came out and clarified what it really meant. You see, there's so much that they just don't know.
Right. And here's the problem with there's many problems with just a categorical rejection or just suspicion of anything that comes out since Vatican II, is that then you ask for the magisterium for clarification. They give you they give you an answer, the CDF, and then you don't pay attention to it.
I know.
Well, how's that supposed to work? That doesn't sound like the church that Christ established. So, and then also even just thinking in general terms about the recognize and resist movement, it's just, okay, recognize what? Resist, recognize and resist to what degree, and how can I be sure that I'm recognizing and resisting to the exact proper degree? And that's why Christ gave us a living magisterium.
And I hesitate to use that term because it meant something different 20 years ago than it does today. Recognize and resist had a different understanding. Today you're begging the question about what am I actually recognizing and what am I resisting? Now it's already gone to such an extreme point where traditional Catholics, which I no longer would really, use that term to honor them with, those who believe that Sedevacantists and other schismatic priests and bishops and independents who totally reject the legitimacy of Pope Francis and the College of Bishops, that these trads are still calling them fellow Catholics. I mean, we didn't hold that position 20 years ago when we were defending recognize and resist. But today, the extreme radical traditionalist movement, instead of rejecting, that fringe, they've actually now embraced that fringe, even though they all have disagreements among themselves as to whether Francis is the Pope and whether Vatican II is heretical. They've got one thing in common. They believe that the Catholic Church are those who profess the true faith and go to the traditional Latin Mass. That's what their juridical bond is. That's what their new concept of the Catholic Church is, and that is not the definition of the Catholic Church. So recognize and resist, I think, has a different meaning today than it did, when I first embraced that movement.
Absolutely. And I guess more directly towards what we're talking about today, and maybe it's a broad question, but just take it whichever way you want to run with it. How do we talk about and acknowledge the existence of infiltration, bad actors, and an overall environment of modernism before, during, and after the council, and abuses. And not that we, we don't condone the bad things, but we
Yeah.
accept the magisterium. How do we talk about that? How do we say we see that?
Well, I think we acknowledge reality. Number one, I mean, I used the new mass as an example. We could talk about other elements that have been introduced into Catholic liturgy since the council, such as women serving the altar, using vernacular, using Protestant music, this unlimited abuse of communion in the hand, and all the rest of it. Okay, and compare that with what the council fathers actually desired. Well, there's a total inconsistency. You can't pin this on Vatican II. Now, if you want to pin it on Vatican II to say that, okay, it opened the door for bishops' conferences to do these abuses, well, the conciliar documents themselves do not support these abuses. I would say that the bishops' conferences abused their authority in the way they interpreted the council. But again, we need to be careful and understand that even though we acknowledge the reality that a lot of these elements have contributed to the decline and the loss of faith, they're not inherent in the rite itself. The rite itself is still a Catholic rite. We know many priests who celebrate it reverently, who use the long canon, who give communion on the tongue, who have males serving the altar, and so forth. So, on the one hand, we don't deny reality, but on the other hand, we make a distinction about what did the council promulgate and what is the official teaching of the church, versus what are some of these more novel elements that have contributed to the crisis.
Yeah, what might be some specific things that you see traditionalists saying or doing that they shouldn't be saying? Like I could, like, one right off the top of my head, just referring to the Pope as Francis as a standalone, or Bergoglio. That's one of those things where I don't think that's it's a subtle thing, but it's a dig at the Pope. It's in a certain sense, it's the beginning. It's like the gateway of like
Yeah.
inciting that that hatred against the Holy Father. Like anything like that you see.
Yeah, using his honor and respect for his title and for the bishops, certainly. I mean, we the problem, Gene, is we live in the electronic age where everything's immediate, and so if the Pope says or done something, we know about it, seconds later, and then we sit in our judgment seat as Pontius Pilate, and make a judgment about it. But does anybody talk about the fact that Pope Francis, goes to adoration 2 hours a day and prays rosary after rosary and is an extremely spiritual man? Maybe he's got unorthodox views of Catholic doctrine. Okay, fine, but what about the good? Okay, there is good there, and there's a very mystical relationship between Christ and his vicar. Okay, and this is another thing people, I think, should dwell upon and pray about, right? I mean, this is the vicar of Jesus Christ, and so there has to be this honor and respect for him, because there's a union between Christ and the Pope, just as there is between Peter and the Pope, that I think need to be brought to bear when we're speaking about them. So that's a good point about just being respectful. But I think in terms of error, I think the trads, they've extended infallibility beyond where it actually ends, and that they have to acknowledge that churchmen can err, that the Pope can err if he is not invoking the charism of infallibility. The bishops can err if they're not teaching as the College of Bishops something that the church has always taught. And that's part of the crisis. The crisis is that we don't understand how to sift the wheat from the chaff, how to determine and discern what we're supposed to believe and what there's freedom not to believe. All these problematic statements, unfortunately, come in many cases from official church transmissions, and that's why, look, if the church is not proposing it as divinely revealed, or for us to definitively hold it with the assent of faith, there's room there that there could be error. All right, so that's important. And then the other thing, Gene, I see is when you talk about traditional Catholics, you're probably referring to those who go to the TLM, who worship with the 1962 Missal. That's what you really mean. because the more and more I encounter traditional Catholics, again, a lot of them are clueless about traditional Catholic theology. I mean, they're more clueless than many Novus Ordo people, to be frank, especially the newbie trads who've come into the church who don't have the first clue about Catholic ecclesiology, which to me is the root error in all of this. They don't understand what the Roman Catholic Church is, that she's a juridical society whose seat is in the Church of Rome, and then all of the dioceses and equivalents united to her. That's the Roman Catholic Church. The profession of faith is held by those who've been received into the church by lawful authority and are subject to the hierarchy. Okay, that's the Roman Catholic Church. Our rad trad friends have redefined this traditional Catholic ecclesiology to mean that the true church is simply those who orally profess the true faith and worship with the 62 Missal. That's a problem, and that is what has led many of them outside of the church, outside of the juridical structure of the church, to now worship with priests and bishops who don't have the faculties, don't have jurisdiction, who are notorious schismatics because they've separated from the Vicar of Christ and all the rest of it. I mean, this would be unthinkable back in the day. Popes have always condemned this, and unfortunately, in the last 60 years, there haven't been condemnations like there were during the age of Pius IX and Pius X, which is part of the crisis. But it's born from an overreaction, and the trads have erred because they don't understand what the church is and what the hierarchy of truths are and what they have to believe and what they don't have to believe.
Right, and we can't undervalue, or we can't downplay the fact that this is definitely demonic. That the constant dissension, this lens of suspicion on both sides, and non-communication within the Catholic faithful, just picking sides. And we know it's a result from Fatima not being fulfilled. Ultimately, that's why that's the silver bullet that ends it all. So Catholics need to live the Fatima message.
Yes.
I mean, as you said about the importance of, if you're confused with Vatican II, start with reading the documents and then get help from people who actually know more about the documents.
Yeah.
And like you said, actually reading the documents, I think we have to be able to get back to definitions and first principles, like beginning our conversations with people within the church with those definitions and first principles. Like, I was asked a question the other day from someone, what general opinions of traditionalists do you disagree with? And I said, listen, you're probably a person who doesn't like ambiguity. I don't like ambiguity either. What do you mean by general concerns of traditionalists? That's about as ambiguous as it gets.
It sure is.
Said, what exactly are we talking about?
Right.
So we can get to some mode of communication. I know that's a lot I threw at you there, but just
I look at history, Gene. I mean, I've been reading about the papacy of Alexander VI. I mean, it was just horrific. I mean, Savonarola, I mean, he said this guy wasn't even a Christian. He was an apostate. He was a public and notorious apostate, didn't believe in the Christian God, didn't believe in God. I mean, this is who was sitting on the See of Peter. I mean, you got Pope John the 12th, who was a teenage pope. Some of the popes in the Borgia line and in the de Medici line, I mean, were absolute scoundrels. Horrible. And not just on a moral level. I'm talking doctrinal as well. So, they say this is the worst pope in history. Maybe he is, maybe he isn't. I'm telling you, you haven't studied history and saw how bad some of these popes were and how much confusion there was. In our book, True or False Pope, we give a little history on the cadaver synod with Pope Stephen and Pope Formosus and exhuming the body and anathematizing him and covering up his finger, and how they ruled that all the ordination rites were invalid and then invalid and then valid and then valid and then invalid and then valid and then invalid. You imagine the scandals that it caused back then. I mean, I can't imagine. And this was for the universal church, right? So you have one pope saying all these ordination rites were valid, and the next pope says they're not invalid. Imagine that. We don't have that issue now, other than the Sede Vacantis trying to say that the Novus Ordo sacraments are invalid, or at least dubious, and we can shut them down because they don't understand what sacramental intention is. But these were the popes that were actually making these declarations. Well, guess what? One was right and one was wrong. And you can't get more dangerous and damaging in deciding that ordination rites are invalid, right? Because, man, the confessions then would have all been invalid. all the sacraments would have been illicit. There would have been sacrilege and so forth. So we've suffered a lot. I mean, the Great Western Schism is another example we could talk about. But the church has gone through this, and the bark of Peter has been rocked by a lot of storms. Okay, this is one. But if you're grounded in your faith, if you know what the Roman Catholic Church is and what we're supposed to believe, then you know what? You don't get too shaken by these things.
Right. And learning from history, who might be some good examples of saints or just people that maybe more famous people that have expressed dissatisfaction within the church in a way that's in a proper way? Who are some people we could look to as
I
good
think Fulton
role
Sheen
models?
is a great one. I mean, he's one of the most recent ones where he acknowledged all the problems in the church. Watch some of the videos that Bishop Sheen made concerning the crisis in the church, the potential coming of the Antichrist, the infiltration, and popes going back to Leo the 13th, Blessed Pius IX, Gregory the 16th, and on. In terms of talking about the infiltration and the Masonic and communist infiltration of the Catholic Church, they saw this coming over 100 years ago. Pius X said modernism was already deeply seated in the hearts and veins of the church. Imagine that in 1904, whatever it was, where he wrote the encyclical Pascendi about modernism. I mean, this has been going on for some time now. Again, we have so much information overload that we just get more now than we did back then. But the popes pre-Vatican II also acknowledged a lot of the crisis, a lot of the infiltration. And I don't believe, Gene, that this all was precipitated by Vatican II. If you look at Pius XI and Pius XII, they were lamenting a lot. The church wasn't, perfect before the council. There was a lot of loss of faith, even before the sexual revolution. The church has always had struggles. And I'm not trying to play down what's going on in Rome today. I'm not trying to do that. But what I'm trying to encourage Catholics to do is to know your faith and continue, to persevere in that faith. Don't be shaken by these storms. Christ is in charge, right? So whatever this pope does and whatever the next pope does, who could be even worse than this pope, if it's happening, you know that our Lord Jesus Christ is permitting it. He is willing to permit this crisis. Why? Think of it as a test of faith. Think of it as a test of faith, and you don't want to fail that test. You fail the test if you leave the bark of Peter. But if you stay in the bark, even though Christ might be asleep and the apostles are thinking they're going to perish, so you stay in that bark, you're going to ultimately win the fight. That's what we need to do.
Right. Exactly. And we look at, okay, well, another document's released. Well, guess what? There's probably going to be another one in the summer, and then another one's going to come, and
Right.
and it'll probably get worse, and unfortunately a lot worse. I don't want to be pessimistic, but as
Yep.
Fatima, we
I
got to
think
go
so.
back to Fatima. It will continue to get worse. So rather than when we do get the next document or we learn about the next possibly scandalous thing or something that was even just blown out of proportion, what should the Catholic do first? Is it run on social media, post something, and join the banter, or we encourage others to take a step back? Let's see what actually happened, and then maybe discuss it privately with the pastor before we go running our mouths, as I've been so often guilty of myself.
People have been begging me for years now to do my own podcast and to do this on a daily or weekly basis, and I'm not tempted to do it because it does take away from the spiritual life. I think if people were more, attuned to the spiritual, to mental prayer, and in the spiritual life, this would have less turmoil for them. Once you start glomming onto the negative, that's where it becomes divisive. The devil's all over the negative. We know that the negative, he's playing in that field. So I don't think most Catholics shouldn't even enter into the fray, in my opinion, because most of them don't know enough to be able to fight the battle. Really, there's a lot that you need to know to sift through these things, and it's taken me, decades to do it. Okay, so if something comes out, though, like you said, Gene, that something comes out of the Vatican, well, I'll read it, I'll assess it, and I'll know what the profession of faith is. I know what the hierarchy of truths is. I still recognize that these men are the legitimate authorities of the church. I recognize that there is no salvation outside of the juridical structure of the church. I recognize that Eugene IV said that I must be in submission and subjection to the Roman Pontiff for my salvation. So that's where I'm going to be. So if I can't reconcile it, okay, then I'm going to ignore it. If I can, fine. If somebody wants to ask me my opinion, I will, but it's not going to shake my faith. And to the extent that somebody wants to attack Holy Mother Church, I'll be first in line to confront that person and defend Holy Mother Church. If it's a legitimate argument, let's debate the merits of it. But again, I don't think it's something that should take us away from the real battle, which is grace, staying in a state of grace and trying to get to the finish line and die in a state of grace.
Right, absolutely. Oh, so important, and so many important points you made there, and that's it. I mean, that's being rock solid on those first principles and those definitions, like you said, the hierarchy of truths. Once you have that, now
Yeah.
everything's in its proper frame. We have to get past the
Yeah.
back and forth and start discussing that among Catholics.
You know,
That's
Gene, what comes to mind too is, sorry to interrupt you, but they, my traditional friends have taken, a posture where they really tend to interpret things in the worst possible light. They focus on the negative almost exclusively, and then within that negativity, they interpret things in the worst possible light. But you know what? I don't trust everything that they say or anybody says. I want to look at it for myself. But when I actually look into things that are being accused, it often tends not to be the actual case. Pope Francis said this, but he really didn't say this, or this footnote says this, and I read it and it doesn't say that. So again, be careful. Don't accept things at face value. And again, as Catholics, we should be trying to interpret everything in the most favorable light.
right. If we're supposed to do that with just our friends or someone right off the street, how much more so for our Holy Father? Christ established that hierarchy, not us.
Yeah.
And it's all symptomatic. I can underplay the importance of living the Fatima message. Going back to that Blue Army pledge that Sister Lucia wrote herself in response to the question, "What must the faithful do to merit the triumph of the Immaculate Heart of Mary?" So
Yeah.
it's wearing the brown scapular, praying the rosary every day, offering up our sufferings,
Yeah.
first Saturday devotion.
Right.
That's what we need to do. That's where we should be at.
We need to have a crusade. Really, what's been lost in the Fatima message, in my view, is the fact that the Holy Father does have to give formal ecclesiastical approbation to the 5 first Saturdays. I think once he does that, that's when we're going to see a change in the world. I was reading Lucia's diaries the other day, and she says that that's going to happen, but the implication was it wasn't going to happen until the great conflagration is over, or at least is occurring, which is a concern. But the bottom line is, yeah, okay, the consecration is one aspect of it, but we need the Holy Father to formally approve the 5 first Saturdays, and we need to have those first Saturdays lived out in our lives. That to me is that missing piece. We've got to get that.
Right. And it seems like if enough of the faithful aren't doing these things, consecrating ourselves to Mary, the rosary,
Yeah,
the scapular, all these things, then we're not going to merit the grace for the Holy Father to do that.
I know. Yeah, I agree with that, Gene, a lot. The 5 first Saturdays, as days of reparation for the sins committed against Our Lady's Immaculate Heart. That's key. So I think that's the missing element right now. When we pray for that, because that will usher in the triumph of Our Lady's Immaculate Heart. But I'm with you. I'm still very concerned about the future. I'm very concerned about the next conclave and about what's to come. My head's not in the sand. But again, because I'm grounded and I understand the profession of faith and the hierarchy of truths and the traditional ecclesiology of the church, and what our duty is as Catholics, that's the main thing. After all, Christ is calling us to live a life of faith and perseverance amidst the storms that he's willing to permit. So let's look at it as simple as that.
Excellent. Absolutely. Thank you, John, for being a light in all this darkness for me and helping me mess up my mind, basically clarify things in my mind. It's been so important for me, and especially then what I've been talking about with my circle of friends. It's been a tremendous help.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad to have the opportunity to discuss this, and we can fortify each other, right? I mean, that really helps that we're in this battle together. And again, for me, it's an overreaction on the right, which is a reaction to all the liberal stuff on the left. We've gone too far. And, for me, I'm back into the center, which is kind of where I started. And I've had to work through a lot of issues, all the way from John Paul II's pontificate in Assisi all the way up to the current day. I mean, I remember all of that stuff. And you know what? It's been a mess, but I always go back to the fact that Christ is willing to permit this. It's a test of faith. We need to stay in the bark and we need to persevere.
Absolutely. Starts with how we communicate with one another, and knowing these first principles of our Catholic faith. Thanks again, John. How do people find you, more of your information and materials? Where do we send them?
The best way right now is at trueorfalsepope.com. Trueorfalsepope.com is where they can reach me by email and look for our latest articles.
Excellent. Thanks again, John. God bless
All
you.
right,
God bless
Gene.
your family.
God bless
Take
you
care.
too. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.